A few words on the death of Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader and a ruthless terrorist. I want to get that out there because I don't want any doubt as to my thoughts on the matter in terms of how I perceive the likes of Nasrallah. He was a ruthless terrorist who deliberately targeted Israeli civilians. Um, Deliberately targeting civilians is the definition of terrorism um, for a violent political objective. Now, this has been confirmed by Hezbollah. They've called him a martyr. Sometimes when we hear reports of these sort of things, there's some uncertainty over it, but it has been confirmed by both Israel and Hezbollah. So I think we could safely say he is dead. Apparently, it was in an airstrike in the southern suburbs of Beirut. I don't think any reasonable person should cry a tear over Hassan Nasrallah. This was a man who caused a lot of misery to a lot of people. And I also think it's a victory for Israel insofar as he was a much bigger name in Hezbollah than Ismail Haniyeh or Mohammed Daif were in Hamas. They, of course, were killed earlier in the year. Um, the sort of spiritual head of Hamas and thought to be the main figurehead on the ground, Yawa Sinwar, is still alive apparently. So that's well, there's uncertainty over that, but no doubt about it, Nasrallah was the boss of Hezbollah. So in of itself, I'm not going to cry any tears over it. I think it's the demise of a terrorist is always a good thing insofar as it's the demise of someone who is deliberately a threat to civilians. That cannot be a bad thing. Um, Nevertheless, I wouldn't be too triumphalist in in terms of what we're seeing in the Near East right now because it's escalating every day. Um, Now Israel has launched airstrikes against Yemen after airstrikes into Israel from the Houthis. It's just a situation that's really spiraling. I won't say out of control at this point, but it's pretty serious. Israel's trying to fight a war now on three fronts against Hamas in Gaza, against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and now against the Houthis in Yemen. And I think that can be reckless because Israel is banking solely on American support for this. Israel's powerful in terms of its size, but is it really practical to be trying to fight a war on three fronts? Now, the counter argument is it's got no choice. It really has no choice because it is being attacked on three fronts. Um, I think Iran's influence in the region is utterly toxic, and I think that many Iranian people may well ask the question, why is their government um, dragging Iran into this war? And not that it's a new thing, it's been going on for years, but goodness knows there's plenty of domestic problems in Iran. Only this week there was a big coal mining disaster, over 50 miners killed. Iran has plenty of domestic problems. Um, and I just think that one of the purposes of getting itself tied up in these wars with Israel is to distract the domestic audience from its own brutal record. Thousands of Iranians killed over the years in massacres, crackdowns, torture. It's a ghastly, ghastly regime, and I think one of the biggest destabilizing forces, not just in the Middle East, in the world actually. Um, Recently I've been pretty critical of Israel. I do have a problem with the fact that entire families are wiped out in Lebanon and Gaza, and Israel tells people to go to safe parts, and there is no safe places. I also have a problem with the premise that we get from conservatives in the West and pro-Israelis that effectively stipulates Israel cannot be criticized. I think that's a bad narrative. But there is a flip side to that, which is in much of the Islamic world and indeed in much of the UN, Israel is singled out. Now, that is fundamentally unfair. Um, for example, after the death of Nasrallah, there were violent protests in Karachi, Pakistan. Now, why is there not violent protests in Karachi or Lahore or Rawalpindi or other big Pakistani cities over China's brutal treatment of Uyghur Muslims? I think it really casts big doubt on the so-called Islamic Ummah, that is to say, that it's Muslim Brotherhood. You know, Muslims are being persecuted as they see it in Palestine and Lebanon. So we're anti-Israel, but they don't seem to care about Muslims in China, in Xinjiang, Greater Turkestan, the only Islamic country that seems to care about that. And it's a country I have also taken issue with, but to be fair, at least they've been outspoken on this, is Turkey. The only Islamic country, well, maybe Turkey and Azerbaijan, but the rest of the Islamic world don't seem to care about Uyghur Muslims. Why not? I mean, why do they care more about Lebanese and Palestinian Muslims than Uyghur Muslims who have been tortured, forcibly separated from their families, mass incarcerated by the Chinese state? It's politics, because Beijing and Islamabad have close ties. So I would say it's absolute hypocrisy to single Israel out. Now, in terms of the death of Nasrallah, I have no moral issues with that. And I've criticized Israel, but I am not going to criticize Israel for killing Nasrallah. He is a terrorist who has targeted Israeli civilians. Israel has every right to defend its civilians. So I'm not going to criticize Israel for that. I think it's justified. I am concerned about a ground invasion of Lebanon. That's the last thing the Lebanese people need. And whilst Hezbollah are the architects of much of the misery in Lebanon, Israel launching a war in it isn't going to help either. The last thing Lebanon needs is a full scale war. This is a country that has been plagued by wars over the decades. It's plagued by economic collapse. It's a country that this is the last thing it needs. And I can imagine a situation where, for example, an Israeli airstrike could well kill American or British nationals, and that will raise real questions about our blind support for Israel's actions. And I do question the judgment of trying to fight a war on three fronts. Um, I think that Israel is justified in going after Hezbollah, but a ground invasion, I don't know. I think that goes too far. Lebanon is a sovereign nation after all, and you can make the argument that the Lebanese government's very weak. It's controlled by Hezbollah. Hopefully, the death of Nasrallah will greatly weaken Hezbollah. That would be a good thing. I definitely think that's a good thing. But after all, Lebanon is a sovereign nation, and so I think it doesn't help for Britain and America to just go along with that. And to be fair, they haven't. To be fair, both Starmer and Biden have warned against an escalation of this. At the UN, of course, many other spokespeople spoke out against the escalation. Western countries are a bit more nuanced. The Norwegian, I believe, foreign minister was speaking about the escalation, and countries that previously had good relations with Israel, or at least peace with Israel, are now being dragged into this. Um, the Indonesian foreign minister, she was setting, focusing on Israel, of course, because this is what the Islamic world often does. I do have a problem with the hypocrisy. I mean, why did the Indonesians, for example, not condemn Assad's brutal use of, his killing of Syrian civilians? I've been critical of Israel recently, but I will say that it is unfair to single Israel out and turn a blind eye to what Arab dictators do to their own people. In over a decade of war, over 500,000 Syrians have been killed in a war largely started by Assad's brutal crackdown of legitimate protest. And what were those protests? They weren't Islamists. They were protests against rising fuel prices, against unemployment, against corruption, against police brutality. I would argue that Islamist groups like ISIS took advantage of the situation in part because Russia and China vetoed action against Assad. So I do think that there is huge hypocrisy in the Islamic world when it comes to turning a blind eye to what Arab dictators do versus what Israel does. And I don't condone everything Israel does. I do have a problem with just blitzing for Gaza into the Stone Age. I mean, apparently more bombs have been dropped on Gaza than the combined World War II aerial bombardments of London, Hamburg, and Dresden combined. Now, it's all very well saying we give civilians warnings, but these people have nowhere to go. And in the end of the day, if you wipe out an entire family, they're not going to say, "Oh well, it's collateral damage," that ghastly term. If anything, that will only embolden the likes of Hezbollah, which I think is awful. I don't want them to be emboldened. I want them to be destroyed, quite frankly. If Israel destroys Hamas and Hezbollah, that can only be a good thing. The problem is this strategy isn't working, at least not in the case of Hamas. It's dubious how many Hamas fighters have been killed compared to how many fighters they have, and certainly compared to the number of civilians killed. Um, I wouldn't say to Israel, you must negotiate with Hamas with the prerequisite that you just accept their genocidal policies towards Israel. And that's a thing that a lot of those calling for peace need to recognize. Hamas doesn't want true peace. They want the elimination of the Jewish state. And they want basically every Jew on the planet killed. Certainly every Jew in Israel. They are violently anti Semitic and they do have a genocidal constitution. So it's all very well for people like me to say, I'm uncomfortable with the number of Palestinians and Lebanese civilians being killed, and I am. And I am critical of some of Israel's war crimes. Unquestionably, there have been war crimes committed, but Israel is in a unique situation here. There is no other country in the world that has its very existence threatened so profoundly. I mean, certainly Ukraine has had its existence threatened by Russia, but at least Ukraine enjoys a lot more support than Israel, although I do think there's differences in the situation as well. And it also has to be said that in the case of Ukraine, you have powerful parties like Brazil and China that shamefully appease Putin's aggression. So I suppose there's some similarities there, but differences as well. I think it's muddied by the fact that Ukraine hasn't killed thousands of Russian civilians in its bid to defend itself. Israel, whatever way you gloss it over, has killed thousands of Palestinians. Maybe not deliberately, but that has been a result of its military actions. And whatever way you gloss it over, that's bad PR for Israel. Now, I'll just conclude this by saying those pushing for a ceasefire. And the Indonesian foreign minister, she said this is a contradiction for Israel to talk about peace and then wage war. And it's kind of like escalate to de-escalate. It is definitely a flawed policy, but all of those who attack Israel have to take into consideration that Hezbollah and Hamas exist for the elimination of the Jewish state. And it's fine to criticize Israel, but it has to be coupled with criticism of Hezbollah and Hamas. I have no respect for arguments that criticize Israel but ignore any sort of focus on what Hezbollah and Hamas stand for. And that's where a lot of the Islamic world is hypocritical. They say the West is hypocritical to back Israel, but they're also hypocritical to turn a blind eye to the genocidal policies of Hezbollah and Hamas backed by Iran. So if they truly want peace, they need to rein in on Hezbollah and Hamas as well. Fine, they can criticize Israel, but they also have to criticize Hamas and Hezbollah for their targeting of Israeli civilians and for, in the case of Hezbollah, well, actually in the case of Hamas as well, how they've treated their own people, the people they supposedly are defending. Hezbollah has brought this war to Lebanon. And we can criticize Israel's use of aerial bombardment, but it is Hezbollah and Hamas that primarily have. I mean, you could almost make this analogy. Let's see Israel as a sleeping giant. A giant in the sense it's a small country, but a giant in the sense it's backed by the United States. It's incredibly stupid and incredibly reckless to provoke Israel, knowing that Israel is going to respond robustly, especially with Netanyahu and government. It's almost like Hezbollah and Hamas want wars. They want wars with Israel. They don't want peace. They want wars with Israel. So recently I have been critical of Israel, but in no way does that mean I'm sympathetic to Hamas or Hezbollah. And I think I do stand by Israel's right to go after the likes of Hassan Nasrallah and those who protest in Karachi or Jakarta or other parts of the Islamic world against Israel, I would say they're sheer hypocrites because the same people have nothing to say about Assad dropping barrel bombs on civilians in Damascus or Aleppo. Absolute hypocrisy.